Some are calling it an epic failure, another massive global conference with uncertain results. Reports say that the Rio Plus 20 conference on sustainable development was the largest UN conference in history. But some notable personalities decided to skip it, creating even more doubt on its success. But proponents of the conference say a lot was accomplished.
One, we didn't achieve nearly as much as we could have or should have or needed to as a species. We didn't come even close. But two, there was probably a lot more than people are giving credit for in the immediate aftermath of the Rio Plus 20 conference.
Tonight on Global Perspectives, we are taking a closer look at Rio Plus 20 from both sides of the debate. Why do critics have so little faith that the conference achieved anything significant? Was it a waste of time and resources? On the other hand, was it a success because of the numerous sideline agreements that were reached between governments, organizations and companies? Could those collaborations be the key in addressing the pressing issues of sustainable development? Also, we'll take a look at some of the major themes of the conference that are particularly relevant to Sri Lanka, including disaster risk management and developing a green economy. All that and much more on this week's Global Perspectives.
Good evening and welcome to Global Perspective. Several weeks ago, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil hosted one of the largest global conferences we have seen in a very long time. It was commonly referred to as Rio Plus 20 because the first such meeting took place at the same place exactly 20 years ago. Much of the media attention, instead of focusing on the environmental issues, centered on the success or failure of the meeting itself. In this first report, we take a look at why some are saying the conference is a massive failure, while others say it achieved important objectives. This is Madhushka Balasuriya from the News First International Desk.
The Rio Plus 20 UN Conference on Sustainable Development is being described as the largest UN conference in history. Take a look at the numbers. According to the Rio Plus 20 website, 57 heads of state participated in the global meeting along with 8 vice presidents, 31 prime ministers, 9 deputy prime ministers and nearly 500 government ministers. There were also more than 10,000 NGO representatives and nearly 4,000 media personnel. But there were some notable absences. Among those who did not come to the conference, US President Barack Obama, German Chancellor Angela Merkel and British Prime Minister David Cameron, some of the most powerful leaders in the world. The agreements reached at the conference are also being described as weak, without ardent timetables or milestones. Instead, experts are saying the commitments were vague and will do little to produce any discernible results.
I can't help but start with what I'm seeing mostly in the reports that are coming out from Brazil in its immediate aftermath, which tend to be a little negative, or maybe perhaps mostly negative in some cases. Some people going to the extent of saying it's just another big conference without real results. You've been following the conference and what's been going on there. What are your comments to statements like that?
Well, I think the shared disappointment across the world regarding the Rio Plus 20 conference indicates a growing level of awareness and concern for the broader environmental and climate-related issues that we're facing. I think that's a good thing. I think, yes, there could have been and should have been a lot more robust political support for the decisions that were to be taken in Rio. I think the Secretary General of the UN and the UN Secretariat and all the various agencies involved did their best to foster a more aggressive outcome. But I think if you consider the broader economic and political climate that we're in right now, it's slightly more understandable, if no less acceptable, why there was a less than resounding outcome from Rio. What we're going through, the continuing recession globally, Europe, many of the European countries who are usually in the vanguard for putting forth the political impetus and energy for environmental shared agreements are very preoccupied right now. The United States President, Barack Obama, his absence was noted, but if you consider the political debates that are going on right now and the fact that we have a presidential election there in only, a couple of months away, it's a bit more understandable why he might have wanted to shy away from that, as disappointing as that might be. Therefore, yes, lots been made about the number of people that went. I think it is a pity that at this 11th hour, in terms of the problems that we as a species are facing, that there is not more widespread conviction and awareness of the very, very serious point we are in terms of fossil fuel consumption and greenhouse gas emissions.
Do you think, say for example, if President Obama and some of the other leaders took a bigger role in it and maybe spearheading the process, do you think it would have made a difference?
I think at the end of the day, what these conferences have shown is they have a very particular role in affecting human behavior. And it's not to determine how you or I consume or produce, but it's to set the moral compass in the right direction. What is the growing awareness and consensus of what we need to do to continue living in a sustainable manner? And I think in that regard, the number of people, the extent of coverage, even if it was relatively disappointing, expressing disappointment, was a positive sign that yes, we are just starting to understand the gravity of the situation that we are in as a species in a world that is very quickly meeting its limit in terms of what it can produce and consume. So I don't think there could have been much more done at this point, because at the end, what these conferences have also shown is that inasmuch as they provide the moral compass, the voice that should tell us how we should be behaving as a human, as the human race, they're also the real shift in human behavior comes from the grassroots level. It comes from communities, it comes from individual nations, it comes from neighborhoods, it comes from a growing shared conviction among individuals. And it's that top-down as also bottom-up combination that will be very important. And unfortunately, we're not seeing as much progress on the bottom-up front as well.
One reason the global community felt pessimistic about the Rio conference this year is because of the limited results that were seen in the 20 years since the last Earth Summit in 1992. Even though there were some important agreements reached in Rio 2 decades ago, the state of the planet has gotten much worse since then. Take, for example, the climate. In the past 20 years, the temperature of the Earth is half a degree warmer, and the annual carbon emissions have increased by nearly 50%. Opponents of the conference argue that if the 1992 conference couldn't help us improve the planet's condition to the extent we had hoped, then how could this meeting be any different, especially with so little commitment from governments?
Let's tie this into the Rio conference again. There was a recent article that said since the Earth Summit 20 years ago, including the examples that you mentioned, Arctic ice had decreased by like 35% or something like that, a significant amount. Do conferences like this help? Then the Earth Summit obviously did not have the effects that people thought it would, because we're in a much worse situation than we were with regards to our climate. So could Rio help?
Well, I think it's also helpful to think about what would have happened, where would we be now without Rio 20 years ago in 1992, and without the processes of discussion. Many of the decisions that were taken there did have a very important effect, like the Kyoto Protocol, which set quantitative targets in terms of how much countries could emit. That's been a big issue for many of the developed countries to get around. And so I think in some cases, in many cases, Rio in 1992 was a very critical event in our relationship with the Earth. Was it enough? No. And in fact, if you look at current rates of consumption between now and 2050, at current rates of how we are living, producing, despite all of this talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, fossil-based fuel consumption is likely to double by 2050. Double. So as bad as it is now, can you imagine what the world will look like in about 30 years when what we're producing now in terms of pumping out these types of greenhouse gases doubles? Part of that is simply due to demographics.
Massive conferences such as this do help put a spotlight on pressing global issues and problems. But critics say if the goal was to commit to action, it's difficult to achieve with such a large gathering. Since every country comes to the table with their own agenda, reaching a consensus will be almost impossible. So the question is whether the resources that go into organizing such events could be put to better use.
And that is, people say that the millions of dollars that are spent in organizing these conferences, can't they be used to address some of the problems that are just discussed? How can you respond to that?
Yes, they could. I think it's important, though, however, to not to oversimplify the finances here. Number one, the awareness, and it's not just, you shouldn't measure these conferences just on the basis of the big agreement. There were thousands of smaller bilateral agreements between businesses and NGOs and governments at Rio. And many of those won't become front page headlines, certainly at the international level, but they will end up making a big difference. You know, in fact, there were about people don't know this, but there were about 60,000 voluntary contributions made online, amounting, and at the conference itself, amounting to $500 billion in pledges in Rio. Just the last few days. And people don't really want to focus on that. I mean, people are more focused on the lack of agreement, the lack of overt and explicit political will, which was disappointing. But I think
Contributions for what exactly then?
for example, Microsoft made a commitment there to ensure that its operations in over 100 countries will undergo kind of a greening. So that, you know, agreements like that, agreements between NGOs and the government to carry out extensive work in terms of providing deforestation support in Brazil. So again, I think a full rendering of the progress will ultimately show two things. One, we didn't achieve nearly as much as we could have or should have or needed to as a species. We didn't come even close. But two, there was probably a lot more than people are giving credit for in the immediate aftermath of the Rio Plus 20 conference.
Kay says that a bottom-up approach is just as important as the top-down when it comes to addressing sustainable development. The responsibility isn't only on governments, and issues such as climate change, food security, and disaster risk management can best be dealt with at the grassroots level. And in that perspective, Rio Plus 20 may have been a partial success.
When we come back, we'll take a look at what was right with the conference. Global issues such as the green economy, climate change, food security, and disaster risk management dominated the discussions and debates. And the agreements and collaborations on the sidelines were probably some of the most effective results of the conference. We'll go for a quick commercial break. Stay with us. You're watching Global Perspectives on NTV Sports. Welcome back to the show. In our second segment, we're going to focus on a few of the major issues that were dealt with at the Rio conference, particularly those that affect Sri Lanka. Can Sri Lanka work towards a green economy? How will climate change affect this island nation? And are we ready for another tsunami? Here's Noriana Fernando from the News First International Desk with that report.
The outcome of the Rio Plus 20 conference was a 50-page document titled The Future We Want.
I want a world where everyone can breathe clean air, drink safe water, and have enough to eat. A world in which all people can get an education, live with dignity, and make a decent living.
The document is available on the Rio Plus 20 website. Many are agreeing that the language used is vague and lacks commitment. It acknowledges that we as a global community face challenges and it encourages action, but that's about it. What the document does accomplish is highlighting a new or updated list of global problems that need immediate attention. This way, other entities such as non-profit organizations and private companies can take on the task even if governments fall behind.
The result, of course, was a document called Future We Want, was the overall document. Can you describe some of the major elements, perhaps as it applies to Sri Lanka, maybe? Some of the major elements. It's a 50-page document. Some major elements that we should keep in mind?
Well, there are basically two major components of that document, and these were the two defining themes of the Rio Plus 20 conference, one on green economy and one on the institutional coordination and the architecture, the political architecture needed to foster decisions as we move forward.